If you're looking to get started with photography or video, this is a no BS guide to finding the perfect setup. And you might be surprised to hear this, but your camera is actually the least important thing when you're first starting out. So I'm going to show you the overall setup on how to get started and the gear you actually need. Also, I'll leave links down below with the complete list of all the products I talk about. Now, the first thing we have to talk about is the elephant in the room. And that is your budget. When you're first starting out, some people are on a super small budget, like $500 USD. Some people have a little bit more, maybe $1,000. It doesn't actually matter how much you want to spend on your setup. Money does not equate to better results. Instead, what you really need to make sure is you have key components in your setup that will allow you to get the best possible results. So the first thing we need to talk about when buying a new camera setup is obviously the camera. But depending on your budget, you could get a very affordable camera or you could spend a little bit more. And it doesn't really matter which camera you get, if you get a cheap one or an expensive one. What really matters is your overall setup. If you're someone that's working with a smaller budget of about $500, I recommend buying something used, and I recommend buying something that's older but tested and true. The two best cameras for someone that's just starting out, that's on a super tight budget, is either the Canon T7 or the Sony a6000. These are very popular cameras. The image quality is fantastic. When it comes to the Canon T7, it actually has the same sensor that you also find in the more expensive cameras from Canon, like the Canon M50 and the Canon 80D. And even now, in their newest cameras, like the Canon R50, it still has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. So the Canon T7 is going to give you amazing quality. And when you just look at the picture quality on its own, it's really indistinguishable from the more expensive cameras. And this camera usually at retail brand new is about $399. But if you buy it used like on eBay or on Amazon used, you can usually get it for about $200 to $230, which is a lot cheaper. The downside is that it doesn't shoot photos very fast and it's not really that great for video. So if you're gonna get the Canon T7, it's really just a photo camera. On the other hand, you also have the Sony a6000. It also has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. And the great thing about this camera is that one, it shoots photos much faster at about 10 frames per second. The autofocus is also really good, and while it doesn't have the pristine Canon colors, it does have this really interesting vintage look to it that makes almost any bland photo look kind of vintage and majestic. I really like the colors from this camera, and overall the a6000 is just a tried and true camera. And if you buy this camera used, you can get it for as little as $230 to $300 at the max. The third option is actually a camera that I have right here, is the Canon M50. This is one of the most popular casual and beginner cameras of all time. And this camera is actually discontinued and is no longer sold by Canon. And because of this, you can pick this camera up for very little as $300, maybe $400. And the lenses for this camera are also very, very decent. And you can get those lenses at an absolute steal because most people are offloading this camera. It does have 4K video, but it's not the best 4K video. This is mainly a 1080p video camera. But one thing that I love about this camera is that it can also shoot photos at 10 frames per second, and it also has phenomenal autofocus with face tracking and eye tracking. And the sensor inside the Canon M50 is actually pretty much the same sensor as the Canon T7. So the M50 is kind of like a smaller, faster version of the Canon T7, but for a little bit more money. Again, these cameras should be bought used, and you can get them for about $500 to $600, maybe even cheaper if you bargain hunt. But if you don't want to buy anything used and you have the budget to buy a really good beginner camera, the camera I do recommend to almost everybody unanimously is the Canon R8. It's about $1,300 USD, but it does amazing 4K video up to 60 frames per second with no crop. 4K 60 is a really hard spec to find, especially when it's uncropped. It has a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, so it's really professional quality, and above all, it can shoot at 40 frames per second, which is faster than video in electronic shutter mode. So this is pretty much a pro camera. And in fact, it's actually the Canon R6 Mark II, which is about a $2,500 to $3,000 camera, but they've taken out all the bells and whistles and just given you the main camera in a much smaller body. So you're basically getting a pro camera, but on a significant discount. It's really hard to find this camera used. Nobody wants to sell it because it's such a good camera. So for most people, I recommend just buying it brand new instead of trying to save $100 or $200. The other thing we need to talk about is your SD cards, aka your media, and your batteries. For most people that are just starting off with a beginner camera like the Canon T7 or the A6000, you don't need to spend a lot of money on your SD card because your cameras aren't actually shooting fast enough to need the more expensive SD cards. In fact, you only need to look for an SD card that says V30 on it, and these cards can be anywhere between $20 to $30 at the most. And I'll list the cards that I personally use down below. Other than that, if you have a slightly more expensive camera that's maybe shooting 4K video, or it's doing slow motion in video, or shooting really fast in photos like 40 frames per second on the Canon R8, I highly recommend looking at a V90 card. And these cards can be a little bit more expensive. They can be anywhere between $105 to $139. Again, I'll list the cards down below, but I recommend doing a little bit of comparison shopping and looking for sales because you don't want to overspend on your cards. Lastly, if you're picking up a new camera body, you want to make sure you have the right batteries because you will need more than one battery depending on how much you're shooting. Most camera manufacturers will probably overcharge you with a 200% markup on their batteries. If you want to save a bit of money, you can also go on Amazon and simply pick up a 2-pack or a 3-pack of batteries with the charger for only about 30 to 40 bucks. But the downside of these Amazon batteries is they usually don't last very long, and the battery does tend to degrade over time, as in it will not hold as long of a charge. But if you really want the most convenient battery solution, I do recommend buying a first-party battery and just biting that bullet when it comes to cost. Now, one of the main reasons I tell people not to overspend on their camera is because your camera sensor does not determine image quality. Instead, it's about what goes in front of your camera, and that is your lens. Your lens is actually the thing that determines your sharpness, clarity, the overall look of your image, and it also what determines that beautiful blurry background look. And you want to make sure you have the right lens for your specific shooting scenario. You need to use a different lens for portraits versus landscapes versus nighttime shooting versus sports. So, for most people, if you're not really sure what you want to shoot, I do not recommend buying a first-party lens, as in you don't want to get a lens directly from Canon or Sony. Instead, if you're just doing casual photography where you're still exploring what you like, I actually recommend buying older, vintage, manual focus lenses. And these lenses can be as cheap as $80 to $100, but these were pro, top-of-the-line lenses 30 years ago. So the image quality is not bad, you just don't have autofocus. And a lot of these lenses have really fast apertures at f1.2 or f1.8. And on top of that, most of them have a really unique vintage look that a lot of us try to emulate in editing. One really great lens you guys should look out for that's only about $100 is something known as a Helios lens. These were old Russian lenses that have this really unique blurry bokeh look that it kind of makes it look like it's a swirl, and this gives you a really interesting look, and it does not matter even if you're using a $40 or a $50 old camera. Another lens that I really like is known as a Takumar lens. You can get this in different focal lengths, and these lenses were actually made to compete with one of the biggest lens companies in the world known as Zeiss. These lenses were specifically made to be as good as those lenses or at least somewhat competitive. You can get these lenses for as little as $120 to $150, and you can get them for different focal lengths and different cameras. Lastly, if you don't want to get an older vintage lens because you don't want it to break on you or you just don't want to deal with something that's 30 years old, instead I recommend looking at a company known as TT Artisan. They make their lenses pretty affordable, as little as $80 to $120 and maybe about $200 at most. And you can get a variety of specialty lenses, different focal lengths, different camera mounts, so you pretty much have everything covered. The only drawback is that they are all manual focus lenses. The overall optical quality is really good. They do sometimes have a unique look to them, but the main selling point of the TT Artisan line is that they're not old, so they're not going to break down on you. The image quality is pretty solid, and they're also very affordable. But if you really want autofocus, probably the best value option for someone like you might be either the Sigma lenses, which are a few $100s, but they are APS-C lenses, they're very sharp and very good autofocus. Or on the other hand, if you want to go slightly cheaper, there's also the Sirui Sniper lenses, which are APS-C lenses. They do open up really wide to f1.2, and they're also relatively affordable at about $388 per lens. Now, regardless of what lenses you pick up, one key thing that I see a lot of beginners forget about when picking up their first camera system is lens filters, because lens filters can really help to enhance the look of your images. Something like a black pro mist or glimmer glass filter will actually help give you more of that dreamy and soft look to your images. And on top of that, something that I highly recommend checking out as fast as possible is something known as a neutral density or ND filter. This will help you actually cut light out of your images, and this way, if you're shooting on a bright sunny day but you want to have your lens open to a wide aperture, this filter will actually help you cut out the light, thus maintaining your background blur. But lens filters aren't exactly cheap. On the low end, you're going to pay at least $80 to $100 for a lens filter depending on the size. But lens filters are not something you want to cheap out on, and I'll leave my favorite filters down below. Now, I've given you guys a lot of valuable information on what gear to buy, and it's probably things you're excited to pick up. But the next thing I'm going to tell you is probably going to be like a medicine from a doctor, but I promise you, if there's just one thing you listen to, please let it be this. Make sure to pick up a tripod and a wrist strap for your camera. A lot of people, when they're first picking up a camera, they're like, yeah, let me pick up a camera shooting like this, down angle, up angle, whatever. And the thing is, this doesn't really teach you how to properly think about your images and really like sit back, take in your image, and really think about what you're trying to do. A tripod will literally teach you how to be a better videographer or photographer or whatever you want to call yourself. You can get a tripod for as little as $20 to $60 used if you buy it locally, and at the most, you're spending about $100 for a decent beginner tripod for both photos and videos. And if you really don't want to get a tripod, get at least a camera strap or a wrist strap for your camera, and this way you can actually help stabilize your camera and avoid shaky video and shaky photos, and at the very least, it will actually protect your camera from drops and falls. You can also pick up a camera bag, but I don't recommend spending any more than $20 to $30 on your camera bag. It's literally just made to carry your camera gear safely so you don't get robbed, and that's it. Do not go out and spend a bunch of money on a fancy camera bag. Now, if you're just starting out, chances are you are going to need proper lighting. If you're shooting video, just use the sun outside or rent lights, but do not bother spending a bunch of money on lighting before you really understand your camera. If you're a photographer, you may want a flash. For you guys, I only recommend one flash, and that is the Godox TT600. It's a $65 flash, and it is honestly as good as budget flashes get. Anything more, you're just wasting your money. This is the only flash I recommend getting. Lastly, once you have whatever camera setup you have, chances are, whether you're shooting photos or videos, you're going to need to learn how to edit your photos and videos, because whatever you capture in camera is like 40% of the process. There's a ton to editing, and I highly recommend investing just as much time into learning how to edit as you do into learning how to shoot. For photographers and videographers, there's going to be different apps that you need to use, but one thing that everyone's going to have in common is that you need to buy a hard drive. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've seen beginners shoot a bunch of stuff, and then it's like a little bit on this computer, a little bit on this computer, maybe it's on their Google Drive. You need to invest in a solid passport drive that's about $125, and this will allow you to shoot multiple weeks of footage and just store it there to look at later, to edit with later. On top of that, you're probably going to need some sort of decent laptop or computer. That's really going to depend on what electronics you have available to you, but for the most part, a lot of people also edit on their iPads and iPhones. If you're a photographer, don't bother spending a bunch of money on Photoshop or Lightroom. It's pretty expensive. It can be as much as $50 a month. What I do recommend doing is getting the free Lightroom mobile app that anyone can get. You don't have to pay money for it. So if you're on a pretty tight budget, simply start editing on your phone and use that free app. If you have a little bit of money to spend on your editing mobile app, I recommend looking into an app called Dehancer. I really love the way they do stuff. It's absolutely phenomenal technology, and there's even a Dehancer online version, which is as little as $4.99 a month, which is pretty inexpensive, and the tools in this app are phenomenal. You get so much for so little money. And if you're a video shooter, it's actually super easy for you guys. Get DaVinci Resolve. It's a 100% free program as long as you're editing 1080p 8-bit color footage and you're not using footage from a professional camera. Now, regardless of whatever camera you pick up, chances are you also want to learn how to properly use your camera to get the best possible results. If you want a laser focus way on how to get the best possible results from your camera, I highly recommend checking out the Camera Boost course in the link down below.